In 1991, Nintendo controlled 90% of the home console market. Mario was more recognizable than Mickey Mouse. No game reached players without Nintendo's permission. They had one partner they trusted to help build the future. By the end of that week, that partner had decided to destroy them. Nintendo made them. To understand what happened, you need to understand what Nintendo was. After the video game crash of 1983, the entire industry was considered dead. Nobody wanted to invest. Nobody wanted to sell. Retailers were sending unsold cartridges back by the truckload. Nintendo revived it. Alone. Through the NES, a console marketed not as a video game system but as a toy, complete with a robot, to avoid the stigma of the crash market. It worked. And then some. By the late 1980s, Nintendo didn't just sell games. They decided who could make games, how many cartridges could be produced, what appeared on store shelves. Developers paid fees, followed rules, accepted restrictions, because there was no other way to reach players. One company. One platform. Total control. And then came the problem they couldn't solve alone. CD-ROM technology was arriving. Cartridges were expensive to manufacture and limited in storage. The future was discs, cheaper to produce, capable of holding vastly more data, fundamentally better in almost every way. Nintendo needed a partner who understood disc technology, who could build the hardware. They found one. In 1988, Nintendo signed a deal with Sony. Sony would develop a CD-ROM add-on for the Super Nintendo. They would also develop a standalone console, tentatively called the PlayStation, that could run both SNES games and CDS. Sony assigned one of their best engineers to the project. His name was Ken Kutaragi. He had been pushing Sony into gaming for years. Almost nobody inside the company believed in it. Now he had his chance. Kutaragi threw himself into the project. Hardware. Software architecture. A working prototype. 3 years of work. Nintendo watched. And started asking questions about what they had actually signed. The deal had a detail that had seemed straightforward in 1988. Sony would retain international rights to games released on the SuperDisc format. Not just Sony games. Every game. On every system. The more Nintendo's lawyers looked at it, the more uncomfortable they became. This wasn't just a hardware partnership. Through the software rights clause, Sony would have significant control over the ecosystem Nintendo had spent a decade building. Yamauchi grew quietly furious. He sent Nintendo of America's president and chairman to Amsterdam, in secret, to meet with Philips, Sony's European rival, to negotiate a different deal. One that kept Nintendo in control of its own software. He told nobody at Sony. For months, while Kutaragi's team kept working on the PlayStation prototype, Nintendo was building a way out. Sony had no idea. June 1991. Consumer Electronics Show. Chicago. Sony took the stage. Kutaragi was in the audience. 3 years of work. A working prototype. A partnership with the most powerful company in gaming. This was the moment. Sony's executives announced the PlayStation to the assembled industry, developers, press, competitors. A new kind of console. The future of gaming. The audience was impressed. Nintendo sat in the room. And said nothing. That night. No celebration dinner. No joint statement. No conversation about what came next. Somewhere in Chicago, Nintendo's lawyers were finalizing paperwork. With Philips. Kutaragi went to sleep that night thinking about manufacturing timelines. About what the launch would look like. About 3 years of work that had finally, publicly, been validated. He had no idea what morning would bring. The next morning, Nintendo took the stage. Howard Lincoln, Nintendo of America's chairman, walked to the microphone. He announced that Nintendo was ending its partnership with Sony. They had signed a deal with Philips instead. Sony had announced the partnership 24 hours earlier. Their engineers were in the building. Their executives were in the building. Kutaragi was in the building. They learned what had happened the same way everyone else did. From a stage. The New York Times headline the next morning read, Nintendo Philips deal is a slap at Sony. Lincoln told the press that Philips was simply a better technical fit. An industry consultant described the real goal more directly. The move was designed to give Nintendo back control of its software. And, in his words, to gracefully F Sony. It was not graceful. Kutaragi found out that morning. Everything he had built, the hardware, the architecture, the prototype that the industry had applauded the day before, was now part of a partnership Nintendo had just publicly dissolved. He went to Sony's president, Norio Oga, with one argument. Don't retreat. Build the console anyway. Oga was angry enough to agree. Sony Computer Entertainment was formed. Kutaragi was put in charge. They took everything built for Nintendo, the hardware, the technology, 3 years of engineering, and rebuilt it. For themselves. No cartridges. No Nintendo licensing. No restrictions on who could make games. They made development cheap and easy. They priced aggressively. They positioned the console not as a toy but as an entertainment system for adults. The PlayStation launched in Japan in December 1994. It sold 100,000 units on the first day. By the time the original PlayStation was discontinued, it had sold over 100 million units. The first console in history to reach that number. Final Fantasy, which had been a Nintendo franchise, moved to PlayStation. Final Fantasy VII sold over 10 million copies. The Philips deal Nintendo had chosen over Sony produced almost nothing. A handful of games. Some of the most critically mocked Zelda titles ever made. Kutaragi eventually became president and CEO of Sony Computer Entertainment. Nintendo looked at Sony and saw a supplier. A company that could build hardware for their platform. Useful. Temporary. Replaceable. Sony looked at Nintendo and saw something else entirely. They saw the company that had just taught them exactly how the gaming industry worked. How it was structured. Who had power and why. What developers needed. What players wanted. 3 years of partnership. 3 years of learning. By the time Nintendo walked onto that stage in Chicago, Sony didn't need them anymore. They just didn't know it yet. In 1988, one of these companies invited the other into gaming. By 2000, one of them ruled it. Small causes. Massive consequences.